Hello folks, in today's guide we are covering my own personal build for the Greatsword. Now, I originally had a more simplistic build prior to the somewhat recent changes made to the armor sets, but after those changes, I found myself rotating between two builds in particular, and due to them being somewhat similar, I will be showcasing them both. To start us off, we're going to do a quick overview of both builds. The Greatsword for both builds is the Fugitive Mage's Greatsword, and both builds also use the same ring and necklace, which are both from the Defector set. The Fugitive Mage's Greatsword is quite simply used for the Scorching Earth skill right here, which is an incredibly strong skill that you can almost look at as your ultimate skill if you would like. By having the sword equipped, you will also gain an additional 10% charged attack damage, which also suits this build perfectly and ties in nicely. As for the Defector ring and necklace, individually, they both add an additional 5% spirit gain each, totaling 10%, and then the set attributes will grant 0.15 spirit accumulation for Brink Guards and 0.3 spirit accumulation on charged attacks. In order for the Fugitive Mage's Greatsword and the Defector's ring and necklace to apply their set attributes, you will need one of the legendary jars available from within Danjin's shop. For this build, we're using the most special jar, which of course increases the Greatsword's main damage stat being strength, but it also reduces the set attribute requirements by 1, allowing both the Greatsword and Defector set to apply the following attributes. Now, with the sword, ring, necklace, and helmet determined, we are going to look at both sets of armor that I'd like to rotate between depending on the particular scenario or boss fight. These two would be the Chaos Ridden and Crimson Fiend armor sets. One way of looking at these is the Chaos Ridden set offers a more defensive and Brink Guard focused playstyle, whilst the Crimson Fiend set offers a more aggressive playstyle, focusing on regenerating stamina by being super aggressive with charged attacks. I would typically use the Crimson Fiend set against bosses like Trocker, Balerion, and generally any of the bosses where Brink Guarding isn't as effective, and it's more key to remain mobile and chase the boss down. The Chaos Ridden set is used for the exact opposite purpose, and works well for any of the bosses that don't run away or use magical attacks as much. To dive into the specifics, Crimson Fiend set will grant the following fixed attributes, being 2 pieces grant an additional 5% stamina damage, totaling 10% when enraged, which is whenever you fall below 50% stamina yourself. The other 2 pieces grant an additional 10% stamina recovery rate each, totaling 20% altogether, and naturally help with stamina control overall. As for the set attributes, we have an additional 15% damage increase when enraged, a 10% damage increase to charged attacks, mortal blows and charged attacks recover 100 stamina each, and then finally, we have a damage received decrease of 30% whilst also enraged. Effectively, what this does is reward aggressive playstyles quite a lot. Being below 50% stamina will activate Enraged and thus grant you a range of extra damage, defense, and stamina recovery, allowing you to prolong this enraged effect and stick to the boss for as long as possible. Factoring in the Greatsword and jewelry sets, we ultimately want to be charging the vast majority of our attacks and rotating through our skills quite often due to the sheer amount of spirit that can be acquired through simply charging attacks and being aggressive. You'll find you will have tons of potential to use long combinations of skills or more than enough spirit to use Scorching Earth. As for the Chaos Ridden set, however, we will be granted the following attributes. 2 pieces grant an additional 5% spirit gain, totaling 10% altogether, and the other 2 pieces grant 5% damage decrease, totaling 10% altogether when unscathed. Unscathed is the condition granted when you are at 100% health, meaning the first hit you take will deal less damage. As for the set attributes, we have Brink Guard, gain regeneration max 5 stacks. Regeneration quite simply restores health by 0.3% every second per stack, and you lose all stacks upon taking damage. Then we have Brink Guard increases damage by 4% for 10 seconds, and this can stack up to 5 times, totaling a 20% damage increase. Then we have Brink Guard spirit accumulation of 0.15, which doesn't need much explanation. And then finally, we have spirit skill gain consumed. Essentially, consumed will remain active permanently, and whenever you use any skill, you will be granted a stack of 2% increased stamina damage, up to a maximum of 15 stacks, and then upon reaching 15 stacks, you will be granted 0.5 spirit and lose all of those stacks. Effectively, what this does is reward a Brink Guard playstyle. Brink Guarding will continuously generate additional damage, health regeneration, and spirit accumulation, allowing you to fend off plenty of attacks and buff yourself up just before countering. Factoring in the Greatsword and jewelry sets again, we ultimately want to be Brink Guarding most of the enemy attacks, and then following up with a burst of charged attacks and skills to get the most out of any temporary buffs. I find it to be slightly less aggressive than the Crimson Fiend set, as it requires consistent brink guarding to gain the buffs. However, it does suit a more laid back and quote-unquote lazy playstyle, in that I effectively complete the vast majority of this game using mostly just brink guards, and never really ever depending on the reflection or counter-strike skills, regardless of how powerful they are. I found that brink guarding was more than enough whenever I was using this build, and for any bosses who could plow through brink guards quite easily, I would just use the Crimson Fiend set instead. So, all in all, one set offers a more relaxed guard and then counter playstyle, whilst the other offers a faster and more aggressive approach, mostly for whenever it's actually required. Of course, some of the components to this build do require quite a fair bit of progression through the game, especially when wanting the -1/2 set requirements from Danjin's Jars, so whilst making my way through the game, I used a more basic variation of the builds that was mostly the complete Defector set, with Greatsword included, and then the full Crimson Fiend or Chaos Ridden sets, basically doing the exact same thing as stated before, only less effectively and with slightly less to bring to the table. So that does summarize all of the required gear and why we use what we do. Moving on to leveling up, I'll simply just explain the rough pattern I followed throughout my build so far. My first priority was Vitality, which I would increase consistently until roughly mid-game, where I dropped it down to 35 permanently once I did have stronger builds put together. Endurance wasn't as important for the build to begin with, but definitely needed more and more as the game progressed, so I capped this out at 35 and haven't seen any reasons to change it. Strength would have been capped at roughly 50 until progressing far enough that I can begin just dumping stat points in. Willpower has been left untouched just out of preference, and proficiency was a stat I began to build towards the end of the game, due to it currently being the substat for all greatswords. There is no genius to this build, it's pretty simple yet solid, and I've only began to now pump Vitality even further once starting New Game Plus, mainly because of the enemy's damage potential. As for the skill trees, I don't want to complicate things, so I'll just highlight the bread and butter for this build, starting with actual skills and then touching on the passive skills afterwards. This build heavily relies on Mortal Blow, Phantom Knight's Veil, and any and all skills that grant charged attacks. The general 1-2 combo is to get Phantom Knight's Veil off as early as possible, and then begin charging attacks and skills at will, depending on the situation. Mortal Blow is naturally great for many different scenarios, but my main go-tos are Inner Fury, Giant Hunt, and Breakthrough. Between these three skills, you have Inner Fury, which is capable of solid stagger or area of effect damage, and stagger potential. Giant Hunt is great for staggering a lot of different enemies, whilst Breakthrough allows you to close gaps whenever distance has been created mid-combo. Due to the general focus on brink guarding, Armor Breaker and Heart Piercer are both very much worth having, maybe more so for Chaos Ridden rather than Crimson Fiend, but it is effective regardless. As for the passives, of course, what you obtain and when is completely up to yourself, but the most important for this build would be things like Avenger, Defense Stamina, and Spirit, whilst also not forgetting about Indomitable or Heavy Pressure, which will help with taking less damage and gaining Spirit whilst charging any attacks. Overall, focus on charged attacks and brink guarding as a baseline, and then build upon this as and when you can. As for the choice of Phantom, there are really only 2 or 3 here that I would recommend over the others, and those would be Keshta, Wulfric, and Maximilian. Maximilian is probably my least preferred, but only due to the fact that I've become very comfortable with brink guarding and don't often find myself using the normal guard at all, but it can very well help with those still getting comfortable with brink guarding. Keshta increases stamina recovery by a max of 30%, and his awakened buffs grant additional stamina recovery, whilst Wulfric grants a frontal assault damage increase of 15% at max, and his awakened buffs grant additional spirit for performing certain actions. Both are very good for either variation of this build. Keshta probably suits the Crimson Fiend more due to the additional stamina gains, meaning Crimson Fiend damage windows can effectively be longer, and Wulfric suits Chaos Ridden more due to brink guards typically leaving you right in front of the enemy boss, and thus able to take full advantage of the frontal assault buff. Outside of these 2 options, and maybe Maximilian, I wouldn't recommend any of the other Phantoms unless specifically wanting to increase Phantom gauge gains or any of the other buffs. Now, to showcase both variations of the build, we will start with the Chaos Ridden set. Generally, both builds follow the same playstyle, but differ ever so slightly. As mentioned before, we always open with the Phantom Knight's Veil skill, then I like to try and get out a charged Inner Fury before unleashing some form of charged combo attack. Most enemies will stagger due to this, and it's great for controlling space, buying yourself stamina recovery time, etc. then I quite simply use Breakthrough as and when it is needed to close gaps whenever they are created, and then the other two skill options are Giant's Hunt, which is honestly just great damage and stagger potential, and then we have Scorching Earth, which honestly isn't all that necessary for the entire build, but I do like the idea of having an ultimate skill, so it will remain. Of course, between any and all of these combos, we focus mainly on Brink guarding all of the enemy's attacks. We will typically only use this build for bosses that don't break through Brink guards with elemental damage too much. So the general idea is to mitigate as much damage as you can, if not all of it, before unleashing with a heavy combo, buffed by your previous Brink guards. As for the Crimson Fiend set, it's the exact same playstyle, only you will be rewarded less for Brink guarding, but you'll find that stamina is in a much better place, and your damage windows will subsequently now be longer. I found this build was required for some of the bosses found later on in the game, as Brink guarding doesn't always prove to be a viable strategy. If I were to compare the two, Chaos Ridden is definitely a safer playstyle, offering less damage potential and smaller damage windows. However, it does reward relatively good survivability, and does still bring solid damage to the table. However, Crimson Fiend does prove to be the stronger of the two, if you're able to take control of the fights appropriately. Now, perhaps I should have led with this, but this is by no means a cracked build guide, or me telling you to use this build if you want to succeed within Khazan. I'm simply just showing you the build that I have gravitated towards the most throughout my time. It has allowed me to face multiple playthroughs on expert difficulty, without ever really needing to use Reflect or Counter Attack, and thus I'd class it as a laid back, but still very effective build and playstyle. Anyway, that is just about it for this build, folks. I do have a range of guides and news videos on the channel, and I will be covering Wu Chang just as soon as she makes an appearance on the 24th of July, so do keep an eye out for that. I do, of course, have a range of guides and news videos on the channel, so feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.